Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's lecture, which I'm very pleased to introduce. We are very pleased to have David Jensen with us today, who is the head of the Environmental Cooperation for Peace Building Program at the United Nations Environment Program, working out of Geneva and covering a hotspot around the world. Since the program was launched, the Environmental Cooperation for Peacebuilding Program in 2008, roughly, 9, yeah. David has worked in many of the places that we often hear about in the evening news, where either war, conflict, or other forms of disaster have basically thrown societies into turmoil. And the question has been, particularly when the UN Environment Program began to look more at the link between natural resources, environmental change, conflict, and peace, what were the linkages, and could we actually learn something in the process that would allow us to recognize perhaps earlier the roots or the seeds of the potential disruption that we then often have to cope with in emergency response mode? Could we work with actors in the peace-building community, peacekeeping community, mediation communities, but also in UN country teams and with special representatives of the Secretary General that are deployed into those countries to help manage, cope, and particularly assist also communities. David currently co-manages a joint partnership also between the UN Environment Program and the World Bank on mapping and assessing the performance of extractive industries. So here is another interesting dimension that often plays into the question of how conflicts are either triggered, sustained and financed, or how sometimes also peace efforts can be undermined by the interests that actually have more to gain from a country being at war or in conflict than in peace. David emphasized that he's not trying to provide, let's say, an academic analytical lecture today, but rather through a personal journey, a perspective of having worked on the front lines of this kind of work for many years. But he also has been part of a global network of researchers, thinkers, policy makers, and analysts who have reflected on this whole nexus between natural resources, conflicts, peace for many years. So, David, it's a great pleasure to have you here in Oxford and at the Oxford Martin School. I just have to say to those of you who may be here the first time, our lectures are live webcast. So also to you and everybody who later in the discussion, when you speak, please be aware that there is a global audience hanging at the other end of the cable that will be listening to you. David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be back. Although I now work on environment, conflict, and peace building, I actually graduated from Oxford. While I was here, I did study conservation biology. I went to Linacre College. Anybody from Linacre in the group? Anybody from Linacre? I lived on Banbury Road, and I also had a whole series of extracurricular pursuits during my time here. So, for example, I spent a lot of time doing Model UN. Any Model UNers in the crowd? Fantastic. I did rowing. Any rowers? Excellent. I did salsa dancing. And finally, I did massage club. No massage club. Well, I must admit, though, in the extracurricular world, my motivations were very much, they were very much of a social nature. I was trying to find opportunities to interact. I was trying to socialize. And I would say, rowing and salsa dancing and massage club all failed miserably. But the Model UN side of it succeeded very, very well. And I actually went on to a career in the UN, which started from the Model UN experience. Now, the last time I was on a stage like this, I was talking at TED in Geneva. And my thesis at the time was that natural resources and conflict and peace building were really fragmented within the UN system. This was back in 2013, so the fragmentation was very extreme on this particular issue. And really, there was a need to consolidate the work and bring it together. And this is what I've been trying to work on for a number of years. And my thesis today is that it's changed. In fact, there's been a paradigm shift in the way this issue is now looked at inside the UN. And recently, the UN Secretary General said this about the issue. that many conflicts are triggered, exacerbated, or prolonged by competition over scarce natural resources, and climate change will only make the situation worse. And that is why protecting our environment is critical to the founding goals of the UN to prevent war and sustain peace. And this is huge inside the UN system. This kind of recognition from the highest level is a massive leap forward. And this is the kind of evidence I want to put forward that there has been this paradigm shift in the treatment of this issue. Another piece of evidence is if you look at peace agreements themselves. In the last 10 years, just about every peace agreement has started to recognize the role of natural resources in the conflict. And most recently, in the Colombian context, this peace agreement in particular sets a new high bar and a new precedent in how this issue is addressed. And it's even hit the presidential level in terms of asking the UN system and asking UN Environment for assistance in addressing this. And President Santos recently asked myself and my team to come have a look at the situation in Colombia and identify how he could maximize what he calls the environmental dividends of peace. So I just wanted to pause here and show you a field clip from a helicopter visit that we took to look at illegal mining in Colombia and to really try to ground this discussion in a real context. If I can just get it to. Let's just set you some context in the kind of reality we're facing in addressing these issues. And as you could see there were two major scars. There was the environmental footprint of the unregulated mining operation, the physical scar, but also there was a chemical scar from the mercury that had been used to process the gold in that area. So you have two really significant issues affecting human health, affecting livelihoods, and are at the very top of the peace agenda. If you look at the donor landscape, there's this question or this notion of fragility. What is driving fragility in countries? And there's been a major recognition that there's a number of factors, political drivers, social, economic, security, but also most recently environmental factors, and climate change was added to the list. So now if you analyze fragility, environment, climate change is one of the core drivers at the donor level, and this is a big step forward. And if you look at the international processes, you can cite the International Law Commission recently did a major 3-year study on protecting the environment during armed conflict. And UN Environmental Assembly has recently passed a new resolution on protecting the environment in areas affected by armed conflict. So the point being is that there has been a paradigm shift, and I've been a part internally in terms of helping move that process forward. And this is really the outcome of a very long journey, and this is what I wanted to talk to you about today. How we got from the situation in 1999 to the situation in 2017. And this is a straight line, but in fact, the real journey was more like this. There were multiple tracks. Some were successful tracks. Some had highs, some had lows. Some tracks went nowhere. Some doubled back on themselves. But ultimately, this combination of work did take us in the right trajectory and did help contribute to this shift. So what I want to do is I want to start in Afghanistan and talk about the very first mission I went on and some of the experiences that happened in the Afghan context. I then want to move on to Democratic Republic of Congo, where if you're looking at environment, conflict, and peace-building linkages, this has all the linkages you'll ever imagine if you want to do research, so we'll go into Congo. And then we'll take it to the boardroom in New York and how we took the field material and the field cases and tried to influence UN policy. And then I'll wrap up with some lessons learned. So part one of our story begins in Afghanistan. We're going back to 2001 to the Bonn Peace Conference. And we were requested as UN Environment to assess the environmental impacts of conflict. Now, when we received this request, the scope for us was a major challenge because until that point, we had only ever looked at environmental impacts from military operations and from military conduct. So the Vietnam War, for example, the use of Agent Orange, the Gulf War, the destruction of the oil facilities, and the Kosovo conflict, the destruction of industrial sites. But this was the scope and this was the expertise that we had started to build in the UN Environment Program, looking at these direct impacts. And Afghanistan was very different. Afghanistan had suffered from 30 years of conflict. There had been an economic collapse. There had been massive displacement. And people had been using natural resources for coping for about 30 years. So we knew the impacts were going to be different, and we knew a really fundamentally new approach was needed. And we had to convince our institution to take on this new approach. And we went to the director and we said, look, we need to undertake the most comprehensive assessment ever. We need to have 5 field teams. We need to look at waters. We need to look at forests. We have to look at parks, urban environments, and institutions to really understand the total environmental impacts of this conflict. And we presented the mission plan, and we presented the budget, and he looked at it and looked at us, and he said, no, this is too ambitious. This is too technical. It's too ambitious. In terms of logistics, too difficult. And it goes outside of our core expertise. So he said, look, I want you guys to go back to the drawing board. I want you to redesign the mission. I give you a maximum of 2 teams. Go back and start from scratch. And so my colleague and I, who were in charge of this, went back, depressed, convinced we were right, convinced we needed to do a much more ambitious approach. And we tried to figure out, what did we have to do to convince him to change his mind? And does he need more statistics? Does he need more figures, more information on logistics? And then we realized what he needed. We came back with this. And he laughed, and then he realized we were serious. In fact, we pushed back on what he had initially asked for, gave him his 2 teams, but we were convinced with conviction that this is what was needed. And we had this moment where he could have gone either way, I should say. But he approved it in the end. He gave us authorization. We gave him his 2 teams, and we got authorization to do the largest assessment that the organization had ever started. Now, when we arrived, we were really prepared to look at all sorts of issues, whether it was chemical contamination, whether it was military impacts, impacts to water, impacts to forests. We had a team of 25 experts. So it was a very serious technical mission. And of course, when we arrived, the first thing we were asked to look at, of all the topics, was the Kabul Zoo. That is indicative, I would say, of the level of understanding at that time in terms of what environment, conflict, and peace building was all about. People thought environment, they immediately thought zoo, wildlife. Send the mission to the zoo. So we went to the zoo, we looked around, and then we eventually got on our way. But it was a really good lesson in terms of terminology and perception of what this issue was. Now we finally got to the field. I think we were very much vindicated in the sense that we had pushed back, that we had argued that a more broad approach was needed. So I was looking, for example, at forestry and deforestation, and this is a photograph from the 1990s. And when we arrived, this landscape looked very much like this. Almost total deforestation, caused primarily from the coping mechanisms people had adopted to survive the conflict. And when I say coping mechanisms, I mean they were burning the wood for charcoal, they were using it for construction, and they were clearing it to grow agricultural products. But this combination of factors led to almost 99% deforestation. And if you look at the same landscape from the satellites, this is how that landscape looked in 1977. and this is how the deforestation looked in 2002. I think it's about 98% loss. And so the question we were asking, and the question and the argument we were putting forward, is really, how can you build peace in an environment that is so degraded by war? If people have no livelihood, how are they going to have confidence in a peace process? And if natural resources are not able to support that livelihood, what will they end up doing with their spare time? So this was the major argument we put forward in this case. But the second major point that came out of the Afghan assessment was really understanding what are the main causes of localized disputes. And when we went, we assumed the main causes of local dispute would be Taliban or ethnic clashes or a number of different issues. But if you talk to people on the ground and ask what are people fighting around, what are they upset about, land and water were the number one and number two drivers of localized disputes. Now this data was collected by Oxfam, but we also came up with a very similar outcome. And again, this speaks to the peace-building process going forward. Localized peace building and localized governance mechanisms would need to start looking at how to resolve land and how to resolve water disputes. So we went to the field, we came back 6 weeks later, and it was showtime. What I mean by that is it was time for me to present the findings at a donor conference. And I arrived at the donor conference, and I was disappointed, again, to see that my name, my institution was missing. It wasn't anywhere around the table. And so I went to the organizer, and I said, look, my name's missing, I need a table. I need a spot at the table. He said, sorry, it's all full. I said, look, I don't care where you put me. I'm very important. I've just come back from the field. I have a very important story to tell. I need a spot at the table. So I left and went and got a coffee and came back. And then I was somewhat surprised to see what he had done. I looked on this side of the table. This is where all of the donors were sitting. There was no name. I looked at the front side of the table where the UN was sitting. There was no name. I looked at civil society. No name. I then looked up at the very top of the table, and I saw Hamid Karzai, President, Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, Minister of Finance, Afghanistan, and then David Jensen, UN Environment. And I had a choice, right? Should I follow diplomatic protocol, take my sign, go sit down in the back and lose my opportunity, or do I just sit down? So how many people would just sit down? Thank you, exactly. Of course, I sat down, and I immediately saw everybody looking to say, why is he up there? But then thinking, wow, environment must be really important for peace building. And I don't know if that had any effect on the outcome of the meeting. I have no idea if there was any influence there at all. But what I do know is that the European Union looked at our findings, looked at our argumentation, and provided an initial grant for around $4 million, which kicked off the largest environmental recovery program that we've ever built, which is still running. And it's really grown into a $50 million portfolio, restoring landscapes, building institutions, and strengthening resilience across Afghanistan. So we were very successful in this particular case in terms of building up a new program from the assessment. So we then were asked to take the Afghan experience and to conduct a similar assessment in the Democratic Republic of Congo, again, looking at these linkages between environment, conflict, and peace building. Now, again, we were first asked by the minister to visit the zoo, which we did, but then we were asked to look at a very serious issue, a very emotionally charged issue, and that was the assassination of the mountain gorillas in Virunga National Park. And this was a crime that shocked the world. This was a photograph that went viral. And we were asked to come in to understand who did it and why. And it was clear from the photographs and from the evidence that it was not poachers, because the bodies were left intact. It wasn't people looking to steal the infants. It was another person. And the unlikely culprit in this case was charcoal traders and the charcoal mafia. They had been operating in Virunga National Park for a number of years. Their business was around $30 million per year in terms of take. And what had been happening is that the local park wardens had been kicking them out recently. They'd been pressuring them to leave. They'd been shutting down operations, seizing equipment. And this was basically an attempt to both intimidate, but also retribution for what they've been doing. And this was basically, in a sense, if you destroy our livelihood by closing down charcoal trading, we'll destroy your livelihood by murdering mountain gorillas. And this was only the tip of the iceberg in terms of illegal resource extraction that was happening in the Congo. We eventually teamed up with the peacekeeping mission in Congo to try to estimate the amount of all natural resources that were being illegally taken from the Congo. And the estimate was around $1.3 billion per year in illegal resource theft leaving Congo. And if you look at the natural resources that were involved in the study, this gives you an indication of the overall value. And the real lesson here is just, first of all, the diversity of resources that are being taken. Charcoal is obviously worth a huge amount per year overall, 175 million. But there are a whole range of natural resources involved in the illegal smuggling operation, generating, as I said, or worth an estimated 1.3 billion. Then the question is, well, who's benefiting? Who's actually taking the money and how is it being shared? And this was another stunning finding, that previously most thought that it was the illegal armed groups that were mostly involved and mostly benefiting from the trade. And in the end, after conducting our research and analysis, we determined that they're only actually taking around 2% of the net profits, around $13 million per year. The real culprits here are the transnational organized criminal networks, taking over 90% of the profits and earning somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 million per year from the resources. And really what's happening now is this collusion, interaction between the armed groups and the criminal groups. And as Akim said in his opening remarks, there's every incentive between these two organizations to now spoil the peace, maintain conflict, maintain insecurity, so they can continue to benefit from illegal resource theft. The other core lesson that came out of Congo really is just how much potential natural resource wealth there is in Congo. Over the half of the land base is covered by concessions, and recent estimates suggest there's $24 trillion worth of untapped mineral wealth in Congo. And this became an important part of the narrative, looking to see how we could potentially use natural resources to support peace building, to support economic development, to support livelihoods, to support cooperation around it. And this was a great example of how it could be potentially done. Now, just to situate $24 trillion, it sounds like a big number, but just to put it in the global context, so the GDP of Democratic Republic of Congo is about $35 billion, represented by this lower dot here. The total amount of ODA, overseas development assistance, of all the donors to developing countries is $131 billion, second dot. The total trade of all fuels and mining products globally is 3.7 trillion, and then 24 trillion is way up here. An absolutely huge amount of potential wealth. And we looked at the numbers, and this kind of wealth could potentially finance about half of all the sustainable development goals. I mean, for all the countries in the world. It's a phenomenal number. And this was part of this narrative, as I said. How can we transform some of this into peace building and sustainable development for Congo? So fast forward to 2006. By then, we'd worked in about 15 different post-conflict operations, and we built this capacity to conduct assessments, to look at the impacts of conflict, to look at the drivers of conflict, and to look at the opportunities from natural resources for peace building. And these are the areas we'd worked in, and this was now a global operation, and we could provide this kind of service to any country that requested it. But then the question came from Kofi Annan, from Klaus Topfer, our former executive director, and also from the president of Finland, Tarja Halonen, and the Minister of Environment. And the question was this: how can we start taking that knowledge and that experience and practice and really mainstream it across the entire UN peace and security architecture? So how can we ensure that preventative diplomacy and early warning looks at natural resources? How can we ensure that peacekeeping and mediation has a resource lens? Same for peacekeeping, same for peace building. And really integrate this knowledge across the whole cycle. And the knowledge was looking at both the risks as well as these opportunities. And they asked if UN Environment could take this forward inside the UN system. We said, we'll try. we'll try. And we started by establishing an advisory group, and this was a group of academics, leading academics, who had conducted research on this, or were seen to be leading the field in these kind of dynamics. We started with this group really to add to our credibility, to add to our ability to tell a convincing narrative, and to really extend into their own academic networks. And then we took this to New York, to the Peacebuilding Commission. And this was a real tipping point. We really wanted to test the political waters, and we wanted to get a green light to go forward. And so we organized this debate in the Peacebuilding Commission on environment, natural resource, and conflict. And I got up and I gave the presentation of evidence that we've been collecting in the field, and different academics got up and gave a presentation of their evidence, and we made a really compelling story. And the chair closed the presentation and opened it for questions, and immediately 4 hands shot up. We had the Russian delegate, Brazil, Cuban, and Egyptian. Hands shot up, saying, this debate has to stop now. There is no relationship between natural resources, conflict, and peace building. This is outside the mandate of the Peacebuilding Commission. There's no need to continue this discussion. We move to close the meeting. And I looked at the chair, and I'm totally uncertain what to do. And he said, just relax, watch, wait and see what happens. And sure enough, he allowed some uncomfortable silence to permeate the room, and then hands started raising. And these were hands from post-conflict countries. And about 20 hands rose up, and they all basically said, no, what our colleagues have said is wrong, actually. In the African context, natural resources are at the heart of many African conflicts, and they're also fundamental to peace building. And this debate has to continue. And this was said over and over and over again by 20 countries. And the voice was so loud that the chair basically allowed this discussion to continue. And we had a 2-hour debate, and we got, so to speak, our green light to work on this and to begin this process. And our first report was done in collaboration with the Peacebuilding Commission. And it was very successful. Very successful piece. We got a lot of excellent feedback. It was one of the most successful pieces we did in the entire operation. But then we had a choice to make. And the choice was really, is this journey ending now with this report? Or is this track only beginning with this report? We had a choice to make. There were obviously political sensitivities, and we had a choice. And I turned to Akim, actually. It was in Helsinki. I don't know if you remember this, but we were in a taxi. And I said, Akim, how far do you want us to go? And you said, go as far as you can. And that was a huge moment for me of leadership. And we took that as an internal mandate to take this forward. And with that, we put together a group of 225 academics and practitioners. And we launched a whole series of books and case studies, collecting the evidence from the field, collecting good practice, and really building that evidence base. And with that evidence base, we then reached out to every single one of the UN peace and security actors. So the Peacebuilding Commission, Department of Peacekeeping Operations, Department of Political Affairs, the Mediation Support Unit, all the elements of the UN architecture, and presented the evidence and came up with a process to come up with a policy analysis and recommendations on how they could take the issue forward in their work. And then finally, we issued a whole series of guidance notes for field operators, how we can design programs in the UN differently to address the issue. And ultimately, all this work, as I said already, helped catalyze new thinking, new processes, which did actually contribute to this paradigm shift in the thinking. And really now, going forward, I think basically people are convinced the issue is relevant. The policy environment has changed, and it's now about taking this into the field and operating, developing new policies and programs on the ground in terms of addressing the issue in fragile states and post-conflict countries. So some of the highlights, just give you 2 examples of some personal highlights in this journey. First and foremost, it was 2 years ago, we were in New York launching this particular piece, Natural Resource and Conflict, A Guide for Mediation Practitioners. This piece was 4 years in the making. It involved 30 different mediators. But ultimately, what was most proud moment for me was when the Deputy Secretary General launched the piece himself, wrote the foreword, and was really very much involved in the rollout process. And it was so gratifying to see him make statements such as this: when access to resources and their benefits is equitable, then resources can be a catalyst for cooperation. We have to work to make scarcity of resources a reason for cooperation, not for conflict. And we have to prove the win-win proposition in sharing resources and negotiated solutions. This is the argument we've been making for so many years, and it was really gratifying to see him make it and to stand behind this particular product. The second moment was when Akim had to present to the Security Council on climate change and security, and to watch him so eloquently as he does, present the findings, present some of the evidence, and really help turn the tide in terms of how the issue was being addressed, and giving it the kind of political visibility it needed. And then when our new executive director came in May 2016, his first priority was to continue to elevate this issue to even higher level of engagement. And he was able to build on this evidence base and this body of work that we'd conducted. So in conclusion, I wanted to wrap up with 4 lessons on institutional change and what I've taken away from this whole process. And I've done the triple or quadruple Ps just as a memory for myself, not for you. So the first P is really play the long game. This took a huge amount of time. It was a long game that had multiple tracks. Some of those tracks, as I said, succeeded, some failed, but it really was a long effort. And I think the key lesson in that is that the process really does matter. How you design these processes, how you conduct joint work, how you conduct joint analysis. It's not just the outcome, it's the process that really matters, because it's the process that allows you to build relationships with other actors, it allows you to build trust, and it allows you to come up with a common vision going forward. So play the long game, but when you're doing that, think about the process. The second P is really about passion, persistence, and patience. It is a long game. You've got to be passionate about what you're doing. But the lesson really here is that there are champions that share your passion in every other organization. Organizations are not monolithic. Even organizations like peacekeeping operations that you might think don't have environmental champions, they do. Every organization has a champion that really wants to see your issue go forward. So your job really is to find those people that share your passion, partner with them, and you can do amazing things. The third P is really about politics. 2 points here. One, make sure you understand your internal political environment. Make sure you understand how your issue is treated by your executive, and if you have internal political support. But more importantly, make sure you understand your external political environment and what the member states are thinking about your issue and how you can basically find common ground between member states in the issue you're working on. And then finally, perception. Really understand how your issue is perceived. Understand the expectations and really understand the terminology you're using, and make sure you're using terminology appropriate to your audience. And this, obviously, as I said, came from experience, but if you manage perceptions correctly, you can hopefully avoid starting a huge environmental mission at the zoo twice in a row like we did. So in closing, I wanted to come full circle now back to Oxford and just finish up on this question of Model UN and how this took me into the UN system. I was finishing up my master's, as I said, in conservation biology, and I had received an offer to do a PhD looking at elephant conservation in Tsavo National Park. And it was a PhD, 5 years fully funded. It was a dream come true. And I thought it would be good to visit the park first and sort of look at the field site and make a decision based on being on the ground. So I flew to Tsavo and I went with the research team for a week. And the very first night, I had one of those experiences that is an epiphany in terms of such a beautiful experience. We saw 2 elephant tribes, or whatever they're called, 2 elephant groups meet each other for the first time in about 10 years. And the way they went together and the way they interacted, it was magical, and all of us had, tears streaming. And it was really this beautiful moment in my life that I'll never forget. And the next day, I then had this crisis about what to do with this decision. And it was this crisis really about the role of academia in higher level policy change. And I was wondering, if I spent the next 5 years studying elephant conservation in Tsavo, would I be able to transform that into a higher level impact that would actually affect general conservation? Would I be able to transform that and have the kind of political impact I was looking to have with my life? And after 5 days, I flew back with this question in my mind. I met with the dean, and I submitted my resignation. I said, I can't do this. I've decided this is not right for me, and I gave back the scholarship. And I was sitting there totally uncertain as to what I would do, but I was convinced that I wasn't the right person to take this forward. And I was also questioning whether this track would have the kind of impact I was looking for. And 2 hours later, I got a phone call from a colleague in Model UN who said, there's a fantastic UN job in Geneva, you should apply. And I applied and eventually got the position. But the story is really more about, do I regret this decision? And I think no. I think I made the right choice for me. But what I really regret is this idea that I had that an academic trajectory couldn't have an impact, that it couldn't have a higher level policy impact, and that it wasn't a viable track forward. And that's what I regret, because I look now to see all the work we've done in the policy work and all the academic inputs we've received. And nothing would have happened without that academic backbone. Everything we've done has been hand in hand with academia. And I realized that, in fact, our job within the UN is really about giving academia and academics and academic research a voice, making sure that you are speaking to, helping you speak to decision makers. It's really helping to construct a narrative, a convincing narrative with that work, and again, taking that to decision makers. And it's also then helping to construct some kind of a policy-relevant research track so that when political opportunities arise in your particular field, you have evidence that take them forward. So as I look back, or as I look forward, I really hope that as we start tackling Sustainable Development Goals, and as we start tackling what it means to build peace on the ground, the relationship and the partnership between academia and the UN can only strengthen. So thank you very much.
So we've got time for questions now.
So my question has to do with the, you mentioned a little bit about from the conflicts to peace building report. And you talked about how you're integrating the approach on an international level. Have your organization or partnering organizations moved forth to establish an integrative approach and framework for policymakers on the local level in areas of conflict?
So that report was really tracing out how natural resources and the environment are damaged by conflict, how they drive conflict, and how they can support peace building nationally and locally. I would say that it was more of a report that was trying to synthesize the research out there and make a convincing argument that this was necessary to be addressed by the UN globally and everything it did. It wasn't necessarily designed to, influence the granular level locally. So it itself was not a framework for sort of local intervention. It was more of an argumentative narrative and a case on why this should be taken forward. But I think the key role, or the key message, is that at one point, some member states didn't feel this was an issue that should even be taken forward. And it was other member states that really said, yes, in fact, this is a critical issue, it has to go forward. But working at the local level, I think that's what I was trying to say, is that it's the localized environment, conflict, and peace building, which is the challenge now. And how do you take this global knowledge and some of the other lessons and actually contextualize it locally? And so that is the challenge going forward. And that was, in a sense, my call for action, is working together between the UN system and academia to really understand how to take it forward locally.
Thank you for an excellent presentation about what one might call local conflicts in what one might call less developed or less politically developed areas. In the West, we think we're above all this, and that, you know, we haven't got armed conflicts and we haven't got all this terrible environmental degradation. But the biggest conflict, I think, is the conflict between big business, the greed of us in the West, and the environment of the world, the climate change issue. Are you able to use the tools and the ideas that you've been telling us about now to address that real conflict between the greed of big business and the greed of the politicians compared with what we need to stop climate change?
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I think going forward in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, there is no way those can be realized without big business on board. We have to find ways of channeling investment and ensuring that business operations are done in a more conflict-sensitive way. But ultimately, you can't have peace without development. You can't have development without peace. Business is a critical element of this. But it's more smart business. It's more ensuring that they're doing the right kind of investment and they're not making the kind of mistakes that can generate conflict. But going to your point about, we sometimes make this distinction between fragile states and other countries. I come from Canada, and I can say that a lot of the kind of resource conflicts we see in Canada are very similar to what we see elsewhere around the world. And a lot of it, in many, many cases, it comes down to two issues. It comes down to a lack of trust between the actors and a lack of access to good information about what's happening. So people simply don't know what's happening. They don't have a good basis to make decisions. And the other thing it comes down to is unequal benefit sharing. People aren't sharing the benefits in an equal way. And those two combinations are what typically generate localized conflict over investments. And I think big business is turning the corner. They see that, in fact, their social license to operate is essential, and they have to do things differently. And so I think we are past that point of this sort of conflict between these two sides. I think it's going forward, and we have to find a way to work together. But I will say that there are smaller elements, smaller private sector elements that are, wildcat operations, which don't have shareholders, and are moving in a lot of these fragile states, and they're moving into areas where there aren't good governance, where there's security vacuums. They are doing some bad things, no question. But I think the big actors and the big players are moving on side, and really there's no way forward in terms of sustainable development without them. So.
It may be linked with the last question, and thank you very much for a lovely presentation, and congratulations on all your work. I was just going to ask, what are the next steps? There was a very nice seeds you had from your program in Afghanistan a number of years ago. Where are we going to see that next?
Yeah, thank you very much. So in terms of the country operations, Colombia is the next big program where we're trying to establish a new country program, a 10-year program. In the Colombian context, we're looking at illegal mining, and we're looking at how you can start to provide livelihoods to illegal miners, and also then how you can recover the environment, how you can recover the forest cover, but also how you can look at some of the chemical contamination. So coming up with a program in that context. In Colombia as well, it's also about local level land use planning. So in the Colombian context, you have territorial plans that are now being developed as part of the peace process, and we're wanting to work with those territorial planning processes to ensure that natural resources and the environment are considered and that information is available on them. Globally, we have three priorities. First and foremost is looking at the role of women in natural resource management and conflict prevention, and how we can ensure that we have women at the table in mediation processes, and that women are benefiting from natural resources and from this question of equitable distribution of benefits, that they're actually benefiting from those agreements and decisions. The second is climate change and security, and trying to understand where the next hotspots are and how can we build localized resilience to climate change and security risks. And as Akim mentioned, the third is really how can we start leveraging digital information, digital platforms, the information revolution to give citizens more access to high quality information, to enable them to engage in decisions around natural resources and to benefit from those decisions. So those are our three priorities globally going forward.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really fascinating. You presented a picture of, in a way, a trajectory line, although it was a bit messy, as you said, but as if we're going forward. But I was just wondering, what are the main challenges? I mean, we hear on the media all the time about, you know, the deniers of climate change and so on. And I was just wondering, how do you perceive that as a challenge to your work and how that could potentially stall this process that you've been working on? Thank you.
Sure, thanks very much. I mean, there are deniers, but other donors are coming forward with the financing and allowing us to move forward. And so where you have a coalition of actors that want to go ahead, we're going ahead. The European Union, for example, is providing financing to work on climate change and security. 2 countries are interested in working on that together, Afghanistan and Sudan. And so we're going forward and not letting the deniers stop progress. But it's going forward at the field level and trying to make this, you know, trying to understand what that means at the field level. I think that where you're going to actually get more evidence to convince, you know, of the need for this. So yeah, we're continuing, and so far it's not causing problems at our level.
Thank you, David, for a fascinating account of a personal journey as much as an evolution. I'd be interested a little bit more in the context of Afghanistan. You began to allude to impact. So can you describe a little bit more what the insights have allowed you to do differently or provide different forms of intervention? And much of what you described as the journey leading up to New York, the General Assembly and so on, ultimately are means to an end. So can you also describe a little bit where is the impact? Where are things changing on the ground in the way that you, the UN system as a whole, a Secretary General who now puts so much emphasis on prevention, will actually take these lessons? And I want to also thank you for making the link to academic research, because this school here, the Oxford Martin School, is premised precisely on that relationship that you alluded to at the end. How can that knowledge help to actually change what happens on the ground? So it touches a bit on previous questions as well.
Yeah, sure. I think what I see at the field level is a shift, especially in the Colombian context, for example. The UN country team is coming together and looking at some of these issues collectively and jointly, sharing information and coming up with joint analysis, and really then trying to articulate, you know, who should be doing what, which agency makes most sense going forward, whether it's UNEP or UNDP or Office of Drugs and Crime. And that never really happened before. So I see more coordination on the ground, more joined up analysis happening, and a better spirit, you know, internally inside the country team going ahead. The challenge is always then finding the resources to conduct this kind of work and making sure that you know, we have sufficient resources to go around. And there, it's a bit hit and miss. I'd say that in some situations, in some countries, the portfolio of money available for this has increased. So situations like Sudan, for example, or Afghanistan, or Haiti, there is a significant donor investment here, and this is a big shift from 10 years ago. In other cases, it's been not as much. So this is why I showed that line going up and down a little bit. Some cases it's been good, in some cases it's gone down, and this is one of those questions of, you know, political priorities, and do you prioritize, you know, the restoration of unregulated mining sites versus the reintegration of ex-combatants, for example. And we're trying to say, actually, it's not about either or, it's bringing the two together. It's using a restoration process, for example, in, you know, those mining sites to employ ex-combatants. And how can we bring the two ideas together into one? So I see some of that thinking happening. It's not yet, it's not at the scale I'd like to see it happening, but it's certainly it's certainly moving in the right direction. There was another part to your question.
Well, can you
Oh, the Afghanistan case.
the Afghanistan, but in the sense also of what you described just now, to me is still means to an end, right? I mean, the UN country team working better together, relating concepts at the national level on how to combine multiple objectives. Can you point to the analysis, the understanding of the linkages leading to impact on the ground, i.e. less conflict or less likelihood to revert into conflict? Presumably in all your monitoring publications, analysis, it's a community of practice out there. Can we actually say there is not only hypothesis, but proof of concept that we can point to?
I would say that we can demonstrate that we can show how different natural resources can support peace through very tangible things like job creation, like livelihoods, cooperation. So we can show how natural resources are contributing to local peace building, how they can be used to restore relationships between individuals. So I'd say on the peace building side, we have some good evidence. On the conflict prevention side, I think that's where it gets more difficult. I think, in terms of monitoring how different drivers contribute to conflict and understanding, well, what's the potential, contribution of climate change versus another factor, I still think we need more research on how to do that. So I think understanding the basis of conflict, the drivers of conflict, predicting the next hotspots, no, we haven't got there yet. There are some good models, but I think that's one big area. Understanding what resilience looks like, is a particular locality ready for a shock or a stress from climate change or from an economic pressure or from, social conflict. Again, I think there's good work, but moving forward, measuring and monitoring resilience is a huge issue. So I think there are some good numbers on the positive impact, but I still think there's a lot of work to do on some of the issues like, conflict prediction and measuring the impact of an intervention in terms of reducing conflict drivers. It's an incredibly hard area.
David, nice to see you here. Brendan Bromwich, King's College London, formerly with UNEP in Sudan. Just to come back on this question of local impact, that I think environmental governance is fundamental to this, and that as climate causes a stress, as livelihoods have to change, then sometimes the governance system just stretches and breaks, and that's when you get conflict. Now, if you look at it in that angle, then peace building is actually about trying to work out what form of governance could come back to adapt to the post-conflict and also to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So I think they're very tightly linked, and there's a lot of work being done about institutional bricolage in terms of what were the former institutions and how can they move forward. So I just wanted to feed that into the mix in terms of the debate, and any thoughts about how that work can go forward at the local level. But I also just want to mention, I think you had a yellow line which went down to the bottom and went in a spiral. And I worked on one of those in Sudan. And because you mentioned charcoal a few times, you mentioned it in DRC, you mentioned it in Afghanistan. It was a key factor in Darfur, also in Somalia and elsewhere, that it is a massive driver of conflict over the control of land. And where we got into a spiral was actually this big question of a joined up approach across the UN, because we were arguing that UN actually spent $25 billion already in Darfur over a 10-year period and built a lot of buildings out of red brick. And we were arguing that if you built out of timberless technology, you could not only do your operations in a greener way with a lower environmental footprint, but in this spirit of bricolage, you could introduce an adaptation driven by the spending of the UN, so that when Darfuris ultimately go back, they would have a new form of technology. But we got into a spiral because of UN's procurement rules, that working in the field, we could convince our managers of the importance of this, but the DPKO procurement rule said, no, we can't do that because
that would be more expensive first time round, and we're just completely stuck. So interested in your thoughts about breaking out of that spiral also. So it's two things, environmental governance and spirals that are completely stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. On environmental governance, I mean, the work you guys did in Darfur and in Sudan is very much in line with some of the lessons learned on Afghanistan, where ultimately, in a situation where you have, high fragility, low governance capacity, it's local level community-based resource management that is essential, and building up the ability for communities to govern their resources, to resolve conflicts, to understand the multiple stresses that their livelihoods will have to endure and be resilient to is critical. So I think going forward, much more emphasis on local environmental governance, community-based resource management is absolutely essential. And really understanding, as you often say, a farmer doesn't look at an individual shock and decide he's going to adapt to that shock, and then next day this shock, and next day this shock. It's all together, right? It's multiple shocks that affect his livelihood, and how does he navigate that process? And so that's definitely the future going forward at the local level. In terms of DPKO and charcoal, I do want to say that DPKO has been one of the most impressive organizations recently in terms of their commitment to environmental management. And I didn't put that in one of the slides, but I had it in there earlier. And that was, they have now adopted a 6-year policy to completely green their operations by 2023, looking at water, looking at energy, looking at waste, coming up and implementing an environmental management system, and this question of wider impact, which is basically how can the mission itself create benefits for the communities that extend beyond the mandate of the mission itself. And charcoal is one of those issues where how can the mission actually start providing renewable energy that communities can use, and how can they pass on that energy when they leave, the energy infrastructure. So I do see even a change there in terms of the commitment and the realization that they need to walk the talk, and that they have a lot to add to some of these places in terms of positive impact on the environment.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a question? No. Oh. Okay, well, I hope that you will join with me and thank David for his very brilliant talk. And yeah, thank you for coming.